Pay attention to the two men entering the apartment elevator in this CCTV footage. On the left is 26-year-old Jason Galehouse, smiling faintly as he talks to the man beside him, 44-year-old Stephen Lorenzo. The two had just left a Tampa nightclub, and now they're heading upstairs to Lorenzo's apartment. Jason looks relaxed, unaware that he's walking straight into danger. However, what Jason doesn't know is that Stephen Lorenzo has been planning this night for weeks. In his apartment waits a setup, restraints, chemicals, and tools of torture. Behind that friendly smile is a predator ready to turn trust into terror. Moments later, the elevator doors close. The camera catches their reflection as they disappear upward. Hours will pass, but Jason will never come back down. This was the last time anyone would see Jason Galehouse alive. In the summer of 2003, Stephen Lorenzo and Scott Schweikert weren't just chatting on America Online. They were designing nightmares. The prosecution laid out exactly how these two men communicated in the shadows of early internet chat rooms.
Let's violate the world. Let's bring our fantasies to realities. I'm extreme, calculated, and love it. Easy to make them vanish with no link to us in the least. Easier to find a loner guy. Less connection.
Dom Dude for sub, Master Scott. These weren't just screen names. They were hunting licenses.
These are quotes from America Online instant messages between Master Scott, whom we now know is Scott Schweikert, and Dom Dude for sub, who we now know is Stephen Lorenzo. These took place during the months of October, November, and December of 2003.
The instant messages between Lorenzo and Schweikert would have become the backbone of the prosecution's case. Digital breadcrumbs left by too confident, too meticulous, too eager to document their plans. Federal agents who investigated the case understood what they were looking at.
That were administered to the unsuspecting victims to render them unconscious and render them helpless over the weekend of December 19th, 20th, and 21st of 2003. You'll also hear from TPD Detective Charles Masucci. He and TPD Detective John Columbia investigated this case. They investigated the two missing men whom you will learn more about, Jason Galehouse and Michael Wachholtz.
While the messages were just the blueprint, the methodology was even more chilling. Lorenzo and Schweikert operated like corporate headhunters, except they were shopping for victims. They'd position themselves at bars in Tampa, friendly and approachable. They'd buy drinks, make small talk, establish trust. One of their targets described exactly how Lorenzo drew him in.
I was sitting at a establishment, and he had come up to me for a small talk. I moved on to the somewhere down the road, and at each place that I went, he approached with a small talk. And in that time, I told him I was looking for my friends, and he said he knew them, and that was the extent of it.
The promise was always the same: friends, a party, a good time. Just follow me. The reality waiting at Lorenzo's house was something else entirely.
Do you remember some of the things that you were talking about when you made small talk with the defendant?
The last of the conversation, I remember he said he was in contact with somebody that I was looking for. They were having a get-together at their house, and he would show me how to get there. So I followed him.
Did you drive your own vehicle?
I did.
And you followed behind the defendant driving his vehicle? Did you drive directly to the party that you suspected or expected your friends to be at?
Once inside, the script continued. Wine, hospitality, an excuse to step away. And in that glass of red wine, something that would steal consciousness within minutes.
And where did you go when you entered?
So, as I walked in, if I recall, there was in the kitchen, poured me a glass of wine, and he excused himself. And that's really what I extended what I remember.
The drugging wasn't amateur hour. These men understood chemistry, dosage, timing. They talked about it in their chats casually, like discussing a recipe. The prosecution explained how Lorenzo and Schweikert turned everyday items into weapons.
Its legitimate use, I submit to you legitimate use, is to clean keyboards. It is an aerosol can. It is also something, though, that when sprayed upon a rag and held up against someone's nose and mouth can render them unconscious. That is what made Mr. Wachholtz pass out. Mr. Lorenzo holding a rag sprayed with maximum impact on the rag. They then stripped Mr. Wachholtz of all of his clothes. They cuffed his hands, they cuffed his ankles, and they duct taped his mouth.
Two men who fell into Lorenzo and Schweikert's trap managed to survive. They'd come forward, brave enough to testify about what happened when the wine kicked in and the duct tape came out.
These are two victims who survived the horror that is Stephen Lorenzo and were brave enough to come forward to law enforcement.
But the instant messages revealed something even darker than the drugs, the restraints, the calculated deception. The prosecution pulled one particular exchange that showed Lorenzo and Schweikert's true intent.
And I quote from the chats, "Use and abuse them to see how far Mr. Schweikert and Mr. Lorenzo would go, and to see how well they would work together."
This was never about consent. It was never about mutual exploration. From the very first message, from the moment they adopted those screen names, Lorenzo and Schweikert had one goal: find victims they could control completely, use without limit, and make disappear without consequence. The digital hunting ground they'd created on AOL was about to claim two lives. Jason Galehouse disappeared in December 2003. He was 26 years old. He had a mother who loved him, friends who missed him, a life cut short right before Christmas. For 20 years, his family would search for answers. For 20 years, they'd wonder what happened to their son. The truth, when it finally came, would be worse than anything they'd imagined. December 2003. Lorenzo and Schweikert put their plan into action. Jason Galehouse became their target. They followed the script they'd refined in their chats. The approach at the bar, the friendly invitation, the promise of a good time. Jason followed Lorenzo home, believing he was heading to a party with friends. Once inside, the wine came out. Within minutes, Jason was unconscious. What happened next was captured in Scott Schweikert's testimony years later. The attack was coordinated, calculated, two men working together. A from behind. Schweikert down his feet. This wasn't a crime of passion or impulse. This was teamwork and murder. One man restraining the victim's legs while the other the life out of him. Jason Galehouse died in that house. But Lorenzo and Schweikert weren't done. They'd planned for this part too. The body had to disappear. No body, no crime. That was the calculation. They carried Jason's body into the garage. What happened there would haunt the investigation for 2 decades.
Where he was and stayed together. Arm, arm, leg, and leg. The and the were double bagged, as was each other part, individually in double bagged contractor bags.
Head and torso stayed together, arms separated, legs separated, 6 pieces, clinical, methodical. They wrapped each section preparing for disposal. Then came the drive. Schweikert would later testify about what happened next, and his testimony revealed something almost more disturbing than the murder itself: the casual, almost mundane nature of disposing of a human being.
And we get into his vehicle and we start driving around the city looking for dumpsters. The first place he stops is a little white church. It's like a little schoolhouse. And I says, I'm not dropping a part in a church's dumpster. I'm not doing that.
They drove around Tampa looking for dumpsters, shopping for disposal sites like they were running errands. And when Lorenzo pulled up to a church, Schweikert drew a line. Not a church dumpster. He'd help and a man. But throwing parts into a church dumpster crossed some internal moral boundary he still recognized. The contradiction in that moment is staggering. the selective morality of a killer. They found other dumpsters. Jason Galehouse's body was scattered across Tampa in pieces. To this day, he's never been recovered, not one fragment. His mother, Pam Williams, would live with that knowledge for 20 years.
You should be already, as far as I'm concerned. You put me through holy hell. Not only that, my health, because now I've got stage 4 breast cancer. I'm not saying that you caused all of it, but you caused plenty of it with emotional strain.
Stage 4, breast cancer. She attributed part of it to the emotional strain. 2 decades of not knowing where her son was. 2 decades of searching. 2 decades of waiting for justice while the men who killed him walked free. The timing wasn't accidental. Lorenzo and Schweikert had discussed it in their chats. They wanted the families to suffer.
21st, that is the Sunday morning before Christmas in 2003. Christmas was a very important time and was specifically chosen by Mr. Schweikert and Mr. Lorenzo because losing a loved one at Christmas time would cause the families even more pain.
Christmas. They specifically chose Christmas because losing a loved one during the holidays would hurt more. The psychological cruelty wasn't a byproduct, it was the point. Jason Galehouse disappeared right before Christmas 2003. His family spent that holiday wondering where he was, and every Christmas after, knowing he was gone, knowing he'd been murdered, knowing his body had been thrown away like garbage. The first murder was complete. The plan had worked. No body, no immediate arrest, no consequences. Lorenzo and Schweikert had made someone disappear, just like they'd promised in their chats. And they weren't done hunting. December 2003, Lorenzo and Schweikert had refined their system. Jason Galehouse's body was gone, scattered across Tampa, never to be found. And now they were hunting again. Michael Wachholtz was 30 years old. Like Jason, he disappeared in December. Like Jason, he trusted the wrong people at the wrong time. But unlike Jason, Michael's body would be found, and the evidence it carried would eventually help bring down his killers. The methodology was the same. The approach at the bar, the invitation, the promise of friends, and a good time. But Lorenzo and Schweikert had learned from the first murder. They'd gotten better at controlling their victims, more efficient at covering their tracks. Michael followed them to Lorenzo's house. The wine came out, the drugs kicked in, and when Michael Wachholtz woke up, he was already trapped. Duct tape over his eyes, over his mouth, twine binding his hands and feet. But this time, something was different. This time, Lorenzo and Schweikert introduced a new weapon into their system.
Its legitimate use, I submit to you legitimate use, is to clean keyboards. It is an aerosol can. It is also something, though, that when sprayed upon a rag and held up against someone's nose and mouth can render them unconscious. That is what made Mr. Wachholtz pass out. Mr. Lorenzo holding a rag sprayed with maximum impact on the rag. They then stripped Mr. Wachholtz of all of his clothes. They cuffed his hands, they cuffed his ankles, and they duct taped his mouth.
An aerosol cleaner, designed to clean keyboards. When sprayed on a rag and held against someone's nose and mouth, it rendered victims unconscious. Another layer of control. Another way to keep their victims helpless while they did what they wanted. Michael Wachholtz knew what was happening to him wasn't consensual. He made that clear. His screams would echo through that house, desperate and terrified.
This is not consensual. This is not consensual.
Those words destroyed any possible defense claim. There was no ambiguity, no gray area. Michael Wachholtz was screaming for his life, making it absolutely clear he didn't want what was being done to him. But they didn't stop. The violence escalated beyond what they'd done to Jason Galehouse. The prosecution detailed what happened next with clinical precision, each word building the case for aggravating factors.
Mr. Lorenzo then violently, you will hear from Mr. Schweikert, stuffed a rag, not the same rag, a different rag, stuffed a rag into Mr. Wachholtz's anus. This, of course, is a battery. You will hear from Mr. Schweikert that Mr. Wachholtz was in and out of consciousness, but it was likely the force of that rag being shoved into his anus that made him regain consciousness.
Sexual battery, violent, calculated. This wasn't an accident or a crime of passion. This was torture carried out by two men who discussed it, planned it, and executed it together. And when they were done, when Michael Wachholtz had served his purpose, they murdered him. Just like Jason. Just like they'd planned all along. But disposing of Michael's body presented a different problem. Unlike Jason, whose remains were successfully hidden, Michael Wachholtz's body would eventually be discovered. His Jeep became part of the cover-up strategy.
This was done purposely, and we know this because a discussion of this occurred in the chats prior to December of 2003.
Strategic abandonment. They drove Michael's Jeep to the other side of town from where he was last seen, dumped the vehicle far away, point investigators in the wrong direction, buy more time to disappear the body. It was calculated misdirection, the kind of planning that proved these weren't impulsive acts. This was their system. Lure, drug, restrain, assault, murder, dispose, cover tracks. The prosecution's case wasn't just about two murders anymore. It was about establishing a pattern, a methodology, a system designed to be repeated. Lorenzo and Schweikert weren't killers who'd acted once in the heat of passion. They were serial predators who'd created a process.
And I quote from the chats, use and abuse them.
That's what they'd written in their chats. That's what they'd done. The invitation to consensual activity was never real. It was bait, a lie told to make vulnerable men follow them home. And the timing of Michael's murder, like Jason's, wasn't random. The prosecution made sure the jury understood the psychological cruelty baked into Lorenzo and Schweikert's plan.
The Sunday morning before Christmas in 2003. Christmas was a very important time and was specifically chosen by Mr. Schweikert and Mr. Lorenzo because losing a loved one at Christmas time would cause the families even more pain.
Christmas. They specifically targeted the holidays because losing someone at Christmas would hurt the families more. The grief would be compounded by the timing, the memories forever poisoned by association. Every Christmas after would be a reminder. Every holiday season would bring back the pain of loss. That level of cruelty wasn't a byproduct. It was intentional. Lorenzo and Schweikert wanted the families to suffer. They'd discussed it. They'd planned it. They'd executed it perfectly. Michael Wachholtz's murder proved that Jason Galehouse wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't a case of two men who went too far once and panicked. This was systematic predation. They'd killed Jason, refined their methods, and killed again. The evidence suggested they would have kept going. Two surviving victims would later testify about their own narrow escapes. Two men who experienced the same system, the same methodology, but somehow managed to get out alive.
These are two victims who survived the horror that is Stephen Lorenzo and were brave enough to come forward to law enforcement.
Those survivors would have become crucial to the prosecution's case. They could describe the system from the inside. They could testify about the drugs, the restraints, the violence. They could prove that Jason Galehouse and Michael Wachholtz weren't the only targets. They were just the ones who didn't make it out. Michael Wachholtz died in December 2003, right before Christmas. His family would spend that holiday not knowing where he was, not knowing what had happened, just knowing he was gone. 20 years later, the truth would finally emerge. Not everyone died in Lorenzo's house, and the man who survived would tell a story that explained everything. February 2000, 3 years before Jason Galehouse and Michael Wachholtz were murdered. The same house, the same system, the same predator, but this time, the victim walked out alive. He met Lorenzo at a Tampa establishment. The approach was identical to what would later happen to Jason and Michael. Small talk, friendly conversation, the promise of something more.
I was sitting at a establishment, and he had come up to me, small talk. I moved on to the, somewhere down the road, and at each place that I went, he approached with a small talk. And in that time, I told him I was looking for my friends, and he said he knew them. And that was the extent of it.
The invitation came next. A party. Friends waiting. Just follow me. The victim got in his car and followed Lorenzo to a residential address, believing he was heading to a social gathering.
Do you remember some of the things that you were talking about when you made small talk with the defendant?
The last of the conversation I remember, he said he was in contact with somebody that I was looking for. They were having a get together at their house, and he would show me how to get there. So I followed him.
Did you drive your own vehicle?
I did.
And you followed behind the defendant driving his vehicle? Did you drive directly to the party that you suspected or expected your friends to be at?
Inside Lorenzo's house, the script continued. The kitchen, the offer of wine. Lorenzo excusing himself, leaving his guest alone with a glass of red.
And where did you go when you entered?
So, as I walked in, if I recall, there was in the kitchen, poured me a glass of wine, and he excused himself. And that's really the extent of what I remember.
The wine tasted wrong, something bitter underneath the alcohol. Within minutes, consciousness slipped away. The last thing the victim remembered was that strange taste, and then nothing.
Remember?
Yes.
Do you remember what kind of drink it was?
It's a glass of red wine.
And was there anything odd about the wine itself?
Yes.
Can you tell me about that?
It tasted a tad funny. I convinced myself that maybe it possibly was corked or turned.
That the wine itself had turned?
Yes.
Waking up was worse than the blackout. The victim's testimony described what he found when consciousness returned.
When I awoke, at that time I didn't know where I was, but I had duct tape over my eyes and mouth.
And were you in a seated position?
I was face down.
Was there anything else that you could feel because you could not see? You said you had duct tape over your eyes. Could you feel anything else about your body and how you were positioned?
Yes, I was, my arms and my legs were bound, and also twined.
Was that rope or twine around your neck connected to anything else?
Duct tape over his eyes, over his mouth, twine binding his hands and feet, disoriented, terrified, with no idea how long he'd been unconscious or what had already happened while he was out. The tape would come off and go back on, off and on, a deliberate cycle of control. And then came the moment that would define his memory of Lorenzo forever. The moment the tape was pulled away and he saw the face of the man who drugged and restrained him.
What is the first thing that you recall when you actually regained consciousness, but the duct tape is still over your eyes?
I was panicked, hysterical. And I remember seeing him sitting, he turned me over and he was sitting on the side of the bed. And I just recall his face, he didn't look the same. There was nothing behind his eyes were dark, his face was contorted, which further panicked me.
His eyes were dark, his face was contorted. He didn't look like the same person. There was nothing there. Black, emotionless. The friendly man from the bar was gone. What sat on the edge of that bed was something else, something that had transformed the moment the drugs took effect and the victim became helpless. Lorenzo wasn't pretending anymore. The mask had dropped. The hours that followed were a nightmare of consciousness and unconsciousness, awareness and blackout. The victim would later describe being choked, losing consciousness, waking up again, a cycle of terror punctuated by threats that made survival seem impossible.
In the beginning, no, but he let me know that he made other people disappear and that would be my fate.
He told you that you would disappear. Did he make it an ultimatum if?
I believe so. It was, you just simply just stated.
He made other people disappear. That's what Lorenzo told him. Matter of fact, casual, like discussing the weather. And given what would happen to Jason Galehouse and Michael Wachholtz 3 years later, that threat wasn't empty bravado. It was a preview. The choking wasn't just assault, it was Lorenzo's preferred method of control, the same technique he'd later use to murder Jason and Michael. The victim felt Lorenzo's hands around his throat, felt consciousness slipping away.
I lost consciousness because he was choking me to unconsciousness.
Was he saying anything then?
Not that I recall.
Somehow, against odds that seemed impossible, the victim found a window of opportunity. Lorenzo's attention drifted. Maybe he thought his captive was too incapacitated to move. Maybe he was confident the drugs and terror had done their work. But in that brief moment, the victim made his choice.
Completely tied me all the way. I had one hand free, which I managed to get myself out of the rest. And slowly on my clothes, got dressed and walked out.
I apologize.
Fully thinking that I wasn't leaving there. It was like time had stood still, and I thought he would either shoot me or stab me.
Had he threatened to harm you in those ways before you?
Other than telling me that he would make me disappear.
Slowly, quietly, getting dressed, walking out, every second expecting Lorenzo to realize what was happening, to stop him, to make good on those threats about making people disappear. But he made it to the door. He made it outside. He survived. The psychological aftermath would last years. The trauma, the fear, the knowledge that he'd been inside a predator's house and barely escaped. And then, years later, browsing online, he saw a screen name he recognized, Lorenzo. The same man, still active, still hunting. The victim sent a message, direct, confrontational, the kind of message you send when you've been carrying rage and trauma for years and suddenly have a way to express it.
I sent him a message. I said, between me, you and God, you know what you did, you beg.
Lorenzo's response revealed everything about his psychology. No guilt, no acknowledgement, just dismissiveness.
He said, I believe he said I was bitter.
Bitter. That was Lorenzo's word for a man he'd drugged, restrained, assaulted, and threatened with death. Not a victim, not someone who'd been violated, just bitter. The psychological cruelty in that single word assessment was staggering. When Lorenzo was finally arrested and charged with Jason Galehouse's and Michael Wachholtz's murders, the 2000 victim came forward. The courtroom identification was straightforward. The man in the red jumpsuit. The defendant was Stephen Lorenzo.
I've read.
What happened next turned the hearing into something surreal and disturbing. Lorenzo, representing himself, stood up to cross-examine the man he'd assaulted years earlier.
Mr. Lorenzo, do you have any questions of this witness?
Yeah, sure. Mr. Perkins, that's not what you testified at the federal trial. You took this and turned it into something 10 times than what you testified the first time.
The victim sat there, forced to listen as his attacker questioned him about the assault. Lorenzo's strategy was transparent. Discredit, undermine, reframe. Make the victim look like a liar. Make the assault look like something consensual that went wrong. Make himself look like the wronged party.
You're playing victim. That's fine. Are you talking Hottie 29 on the screen name, or were you?
I believe so.
Yes, you sure were. On 12/21.
Mr. Lorenzo, no comments after. You can ask questions.
The accusation was calculated. You exaggerated. You lied. You're playing victim. The judge intervened, reminding Lorenzo that cross-examination meant questions, not commentary. But the damage was done. The psychological warfare was underway. Lorenzo's questions got more aggressive, more accusatory. He tried to paint the victim as a willing participant in a drug party and sex party.
Were you going to an after-hours party with Josie and Dwayne to have a drug party and sex party with the defendant?
No.
Did you go to the defendant's house to have sex with the defendant after we did some at the bar?
No.
The implication was clear. You wanted this, you agreed to this. You're only calling it assault now because you're bitter. The victim's answers remained consistent. No, none of that happened. I was drugged. I was restrained. I was assaulted. I escaped. The truth didn't change just because Lorenzo was trying to rewrite it. When the cross-examination ended, Lorenzo sat down, and for just a moment, his face did something that captured everything about who he was.
Welcome.
A smirk. Quick, almost imperceptible. But if Lorenzo thought he had won this battle, he had something else coming. 20 years. 20 years of not knowing where her son's body is. This wasn't going to be a measured statement. This wasn't going to be carefully worded for the cameras. This was 2 decades of grief, rage, and agony compressed into a few minutes of direct confrontation with the monster who destroyed her family. The courtroom fell silent when Pam Williams stepped to the podium. Lorenzo sat in his red jumpsuit, the same emotionless expression he'd worn throughout the trial, the same cold eyes that Jason's 2000 victim had described, the same mask he'd perfected over years of hunting and killing. But Pam Williams wasn't intimidated. She'd been waiting for this moment too long to let fear or decorum stop her.
From one Italian to the other, ciao ciao, buona fortuna. You know what that means? Goodbye, good luck. And this mother's out to get her revenge.
From one Italian to the other, a mother addressing her son's killer in the language of their shared heritage. But this wasn't an appeal to common ground. This was a declaration of war, a promise that she would get her revenge, even if it took the rest of her life. The disgust in her voice when she looked at Lorenzo wasn't performance. It was visceral, physical revulsion at having to share the same room with the man who tortured and murdered her son.
And I can tell you right now, I am sick of my stomach just to have to look at your disgusting face. Yeah, that's right. Make a face, you creep.
Sick to her stomach, just looking at him. This was the man who'd lured Jason to his house with promises of friends and a good time. The man who'd drugged her son's wine. The man who'd bound him with duct tape and twine. The man who'd strangled him while Scott Schweikert held down his feet. The man who'd Jason's body in his garage and scattered the pieces across Tampa. The damage Lorenzo inflicted didn't end with Jason's murder. The psychological torture of not knowing where her son's body was. The endless searching. The false hopes and dead leads. The decades of living with grief that couldn't be processed because there was no body to bury, no grave to visit, no closure. That torture had taken a physical toll, and Pam Williams made sure Lorenzo knew it.
You should be already, as far as I'm concerned. You put me through holy hell. Not only that, my health, because now I've got stage 4 breast cancer. I'm not saying that you caused all of it, but you caused plenty of it with emotional strain.
Stage 4, breast cancer, terminal, and Pam Williams attributed part of that diagnosis to the stress Lorenzo had caused her. The emotional strain of 20 years spent searching for justice. 20 years of living with trauma that wouldn't heal. 20 years of her body breaking down under the weight of grief and rage. You should be dead already. That wasn't hyperbole. That was a mother's assessment of justice delayed. Lorenzo had been arrested in 2012. It was now 2024. 12 years of legal proceedings. 12 years of delays and appeals and procedural motions. 12 years while Pam Williams's health deteriorated and her time ran out. The courtroom heard details that day that made Jason's murder even more horrifying. Scott Schweikert had already testified about how they disposed of the body, how Lorenzo had loaded the pieces into his vehicle, how they'd driven around Tampa looking for dumpsters to use.
We get into his vehicle and we start driving around the city looking for dumpsters. The first place he stops is a little white church. Looks like a little schoolhouse. And I says, I'm not dropping a part in a church's dumpster. I'm not doing that.
You know, the first place he stops is a little white church. And even Scott Schweikert, who'd helped murder, and Jason Galehouse, who'd participated in the sexual assault and torture, drew the line at dumping body parts in a church dumpster. Even he recognized that boundary. But not Lorenzo. Lorenzo drove away from that church dumpster, and according to Pam Williams, he laughed.
And you pulled away and you laughed about it. Laughed! What the hell is wrong with you? You are a sick person, and I wish to God somebody would cut you up in pieces, because that's what you deserve.
Laughed. Pulled away from a church where he'd been about to dump pieces of a murdered young man, and laughed about it. That detail captured everything about Lorenzo's psychology. The complete absence of empathy, the enjoyment he derived from the horror he'd inflicted, the entertainment value he found in destroying lives and families. Pam Williams' statement built to a conclusion that captured the depth of her fury. 20 years of pain compressed into one devastating wish.
And I wish to God somebody would cut you up in pieces, because that's what you deserve.
Him up in pieces. The same fate Lorenzo had inflicted on Jason. The same horror he'd created for multiple families. That's what Pam Williams wanted for him. Not a clean execution, not a peaceful death, but the same terror, the same pain, the same violation that he'd inflicted on her son. The testimony wrapped up shortly after Pam Williams spoke. Then the judge made the announcement that everyone had been waiting for.
So that means the judge has indicated now that he will pull down his ruling. He will set his ruling for February 24th. That's the day Lorenzo will be formally sentenced. And of course,
after 20 years of waiting, the final judgment was just weeks away. The sentencing hearing began with a procedural formality, the judge confirming what everyone already knew. Stephen Lorenzo had represented himself throughout this capital case, pro se, his own attorney, his own voice.
Mr. Lorenzo first. Mr. Lorenzo, you've represented yourself pro se in these proceedings throughout, and we've had several discussions. The rules require that at every important stage of the proceedings that I reoffer you counsel. You are to be sentenced this morning. I believe that that is a very important part of your proceedings.
One last time, the judge offered him a way out, standby counsel, a trained attorney to speak on his behalf before sentence was pronounced. One final opportunity to let someone else handle this moment.
For me to appoint Mr. Gonzalez to represent you today before I announce the sentence in your case.
Excuse me, no, I'm fine, thank you.
All right. I just wanted to make that offer to you.
The refusal came quickly. Polite, composed, no hesitation. Lorenzo was fine. He'd gotten this far representing himself. He wasn't stopping now. What followed was one of the most bizarre and unsettling speeches a Florida courtroom had ever heard from a convicted murderer facing execution. Lorenzo stood at the microphone and began thanking people.
First off, I'd like to thank Mr. Gonzalez, Mr. Sonardi, and everybody else that was part of the defense team. They were absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. And I want to thank them from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. Can I address the state attorney?
You may.
Yes. I'd like to let you guys know that I have no animosity against you.
He even thanked the prosecutors, the very people who'd spent years building the case that would send him to death row.
You did your job, and you did a very good job of prosecuting this case. So I want to thank you for that, because I appreciate your fairness to me, and that's what I appreciate.
The judge was not left out.
Had incredible tolerance and patience and fairness to me while I stumbled my way through this whole process. And I want to appreciate that. I want you to know that, and I want that on the record for the Florida Supreme Court. So I'd like that.
The gratitude felt calculated, performative, like a man building a record for appeal rather than expressing genuine appreciation. But the thank yous were just preamble. Lorenzo had a purpose for this speech, a request. And when he stated it plainly, the courtroom atmosphere shifted from uncomfortable to deeply disturbing.
I'm seeking the death penalty. It's in my best interest, basically, because it's a comfort. It's mine.
He wanted death, actively, explicitly. This wasn't acceptance of his fate. This wasn't remorse or surrender. This was Lorenzo treating his own execution as a lifestyle preference. The reasoning he offered was chillingly pragmatic.
I'll be living a lot more comfortable than I would in the federal system, living on death row, believe it or not. And And of course, that may sound selfish, but I've lived in a private cell for the last 5 years, and I'm going to have a private cell on death row. At my age, I want to be comfortable. I want my privacy. That's what I want. So that's what I'm doing. It may sound selfish, but that's the way it is. You live for today. You don't live for the past. You live for today.
Death row was more comfortable than federal prison. He'd have his own cell, more privacy, better living conditions. He'd calculated the logistics of his incarceration and determined that waiting for execution in a single cell was preferable to decades in a crowded federal facility. The man who'd drugged, tortured, and murdered 2 young men was discussing his prison accommodations like he was comparing hotel options. The complete absence of remorse, of acknowledgement for what he'd done to Jason Galehouse and Michael Wachholtz was staggering. But Lorenzo wasn't finished. His next statement took the surreal horror of this moment even deeper.
The sooner I can fetch myself a new body and come back again, a fresh body. That's how I look at it, because that's how it is. That's how spiritual work. We're eternal beings. So the way I look at it is, the sooner I euthanize, the sooner I can come back. I've got better things to do with my time than to hang out and spend the next 15, 20 years on death row or in any prison system.
Euthanasia. That's what he called execution, a fresh body through reincarnation. Lorenzo wasn't just requesting death, he was framing it as a spiritual upgrade, a chance to come back in a new form. The faster he was euthanized, the faster he could start over. This wasn't a broken man seeking peace or redemption. This was someone so detached from normal human emotion that he could sit in a courtroom, facing families whose sons he'd murdered, and talk about his death sentence as if it were a medical procedure that would benefit him. The judge had heard enough. His response was stern, immediate, and focused exactly where it needed to be.
Psychology, nor do I care. I will not consider what you want in issuing my sentence.
I know that.
This wasn't about what Lorenzo wanted. This wasn't about his comfort or his beliefs about reincarnation or his preference for single-cell living arrangements. The judge would not consider Lorenzo's wishes in issuing this sentence. The focus belonged where it always should have, on the victims' families.
They have been waiting 20 years for justice. Today, that long wait ends.
Today, that long wait ended, not because Lorenzo wanted it to end, not because execution suited his personal preference, but because justice demanded it, because 2 young men had been stolen from their families, their lives cut short in the most horrific way imaginable. And finally, the sentence came.
Ti condanno a morte. That translates to, I sentence you, Mr. Lorenzo, to death. That is the punishment that you deserve.
Ti condanno a morte. I sentence you to death, in the language Lorenzo's own family had brought to America. In words that connected this moment back to Pam Williams's fury, her grief, her terminal illness brought on partly by the stress Lorenzo had caused her. Lorenzo's response to being sentenced to death was exactly what you'd expect from someone who just spent 10 minutes requesting it.
That translates to, I sentence you, Mr. Lorenzo, to death. That is the punishment that you deserve for these horrific crimes.
Thank you. Flat, emotionless. 2 words that captured everything about who Lorenzo was. A man who could receive a death sentence for brutally murdering 2 people and respond like he'd just been handed a menu item he'd ordered. The hearing concluded with a traditional blessing. The judge offering what judges have offered condemned prisoners for centuries.
Mr. Lorenzo, may God have mercy on your soul.
May God have mercy on your soul. A final acknowledgement of the gravity of what was about to happen. A recognition that whatever came next for Lorenzo was beyond the court's jurisdiction. Lorenzo's final words in that courtroom revealed he hadn't changed, hadn't softened, hadn't experienced any moment of clarity or remorse.
My soul is fine, thank you, sir.
My soul is fine, thank you. Dismissive, arrogant, the same cold detachment he'd shown throughout the trial. The same absence of empathy that had allowed him to torture and murder Jason and Michael in the first place.
Yes, thank you.
Lorenzo was led out of the courtroom in his red jumpsuit, heading to the death row he'd actively requested, not because he felt guilty, not because he believed he deserved punishment for his crimes, but because he'd calculated that dying in a single cell was more comfortable than living in a crowded federal prison.